Hi everyone, in this video I'll be talking through my process for this painting that I did in my last video. This is from the movie Spirited Away and I painted it using Himi gouache. So I'll just be explaining my process and the colors that I used and how I color mixed. The full real-time version of me painting this is available over on Patreon. It's over 3 hours long, although there is no voiceover on the Patreon version of this, but you do get to see me paint for the entire time. I'm just starting off with a light sketch here as I do with all of my paintings and just lightening the lines with a kneadable eraser. Before we go any further into this video, I just want to thank today's sponsor, which is SKILLSHARE. SKILLSHARE is an online learning community for creative and curious people. They have thousands of inspiring classes on a broad range of topics such as illustration, design, photography, and much more. I've taken many classes on SKILLSHARE, mostly on the topic of art and drawing. Whenever I find a gap in my knowledge, I will just search that topic in SKILLSHARE, and there are so many great classes that I have taken, such as classes on color theory, lighting, and perspective, and it's really helped me to fill in a lot of the gaps in my knowledge. The class that I recommend and that I really enjoyed taking recently is by Jazza called Mastering Illustration, Sketching, Inking, and Color Essentials. I really enjoyed seeing his process from brainstorming and conceptualizing to two completely different styles of pieces, and then seeing him bring it to a completely finished piece into different styles. I found a lot of value in getting insight into his creative process and seeing the behind the scenes of how you can create an illustration from scratch. As a member, you get unlimited access to thousands of classes on there. SKILLSHARE classes include a combination of video lessons and a class project, so you can put what you've learned into practice and also receive feedback from the teacher and community of students on there. It's created specifically for learning, meaning there are no ads and they're always launching new premium classes so you can stay focused on learning. The first 1,000 people to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of SKILLSHARE. Let's get back into the painting now, and I'm going to start off with some very thinned down and diluted paint. I'm going to work this painting from thin to thick because I want to be able to cover up any mistakes easily, since it's much easier to go over thin layers of gouache than it is thick layers, because gouache does reactivate. So if you're starting with a very thick layer, then it's going to be hard to change anything you lay down as you move on. But because I'm starting with some very thin down layers and I gradually build up the opacity of the paint as I go along the painting, it's easy for me to fix any mistakes or change things as I need to. For the reds and oranges in this painting, I'm just using a mixture of the cool and warm yellow and the cool and warm reds. I also use a little bit of burnt sienna, and I use burnt umber for some of the darker areas like the shadow underneath the ledge of this building. Before I started this painting, I was quite nervous because when you look at it, there are a lot of details and it can be overwhelming to know where to start. So I told myself to just block in the colors first. So just block in what I see and try to cover all of the white of the paper. So if I see a very light red here, I'm just going to block it in with some very thin paint. If I see a little bit of brown here on the roof or a little bit of gray, I'm just going to block that in with some thin down paint. And I feel much more confident knowing that because the paint is so thin, I can easily work over it later if it's not right. And when I say I'm just blocking in the colors, I'm keeping value in mind as well. The value is a lot more important than getting the exact color right. For example, you can see a lot of greens in the foliage around the building. I'm not too concerned with getting the exact shade of green right. I'm more concerned with just getting in some kind of green in a close enough value for now. And then as I progress through the painting, I'm going to push the dark areas and bring out the lighter areas so you can see the form of the foliage very clearly. And to help you get a gauge for the values, you can just squint at the reference photo and just notice where the darks and the lights are. You can see I've gone ahead and placed in those shadows in this very early stage because I want to try and be able to bring my painting to a place where it's readable if I just squint at it, and then I can slowly build on the details. when I'm working on this area where the door or the windows are reflecting the colors from outside, I'm making sure to keep the paint very thin and very light because that's where one of the lighter areas are in the painting. So at first I laid down some paint that was a little bit dark and I just cleaned off my brush and just used a clean brush to actually just remove some of that paint, and I'm being very careful as I work on it as I don't want it to be overly dark. I've almost finished blocking in all of the white of the paper, which is just my goal for this initial stage. Here I'm using some yellow ochre and a little bit of burnt umber in the mixture to just block in the ground. For the greens that I'm using in this painting, I do use the pre-mixed greens that come in this Himi set, but I toned them down with red because otherwise they're too vibrant and unnatural looking. Because red is the complementary color to green, so it helps to mute green. To paint in the positioning of the tunnel, I just mix up some black and some red and just block that in. You'll notice that it is a little bit darker towards the left of the tunnel and a little bit lighter towards the right as the right side, as the tunnel receives a little bit more light in the opening. So I notice these subtle details and I try to build them in even though I'm just in the beginning stages of this painting. And then as I work on the front of that gate, that's when you'll see that I'm starting to thicken up my paint. I'm using a 1/4 inch flat brush when I'm painting in the second layer on this gate because it helps me create the perfect texture that I can see on the gate. So you can see I'm moving my brush in vertical and horizontal strokes and I'm trying to paint on the same texture that I can see, and I'll slowly build this up in layers as well, so I'm not trying to get the exact texture right now, but I am starting to build it in. And I also build in the shadow on the right hand side at the same time because I find that working from the darks first helps me to be able to read the painting more clearly at an earlier stage and just gives me more confidence that it's coming along okay. For the shadows, I'm just using a mixture of burnt sienna and the reds and the yellows and just playing around with those and seeing what I can mix from it. You might notice that the reds are actually a little bit dark at this stage, but I do come in later to lighten them. And because the paint is still not at its thickest, that means I can still go over it with another layer that's even more opaque and I can still cover it quite well. And now I'm just looking for some of the details in the painting, but I'm not worried about getting them perfect. I just want to build them in first so I know that they are there, and later when I come to work in on the details I can refine those lines and make them neater. I'm picking up a little bit of green and I'm thinning it down with a lot of water when I'm working on the area where it's the reflection, because this part is still very thin and very light and I don't use any thick paint on this part at all. I'm always keeping the paint very thin to create that reflected look on the windows or the doors. I'm placing in the colors very carefully because I really don't want to make them too dark. And I actually end up working on this area in quite a few layers because I just keep gradually building it up as I realize it's still too light and it could do with a little bit more paint or a little bit more of an opaque layer. For the parts where the foliage is casting a shadow on it, I mix up a darker greenish brown and apply that just roughly and loosely in those areas. I'm still not worried about the details. And then for the ledge, I mix up some yellow ochre and I paint that in. Again, the details are not refined yet as I'm saving that for a later stage. I'm working on the foliage on the left hand side and I'm just mixing up some greens using some yellow, some of the premixed greens and some yellow ochre. And to tone things down, I add in a little bit of red and I'm going to place in a bit of a darker valley underneath to indicate a bit of a shadow under there. I'm just blocking things in and not worrying too much about my brush strokes, as I know that I'll come in later with a fine round brush to paint on those leafy details. Painting on the front of the gate was one of my favorite parts of this painting. I just really loved the textures on there, and I really enjoyed mimicking them with my brush. So I'm mixing up a few different shades of this pinkish orange color, and I just lay them in horizontal and vertical strokes. I switched to my round brush, which comes to a pointed tip, so I can use that to do some of the detailing on the walls. And I'm just using a darker reddish color to paint that on. And then I'm going back to my flat brush to block in the gateway, which is a little bit darker on the left and a little bit lighter on the right. And I'm using black mixed with red and some burnt umber to paint that in. And for the edges of it, I go back again to my round brush so I can get more control over it. And then I'm going to move on to another section of this painting, as I don't want to just focus all my attention on the front of the gate, because I want to bring this piece forward all at once and not just work on it section by section. I'm trying to instead build it up in layers from thin to thick, and I want the painting to progress at the same time. I'm starting to work more on the details in front of the windows here. And as much as they intimidate me because I just feel like there's a lot of lines and I don't know where to start, I just tell myself to just start somewhere and just place in what I can see. And I'll come back to it later if I need to. I can always fix things up, and nothing is really permanent unless it's laid on very thickly in a very dark color. I can even go in between the lines I laid in and add in more color and paint behind it, like I am with the blue, as I'm trying to darken some of the reflections. Knowing this makes me feel a little bit more free when I'm painting and helps me to just keep progressing with the painting. Otherwise I would feel stuck and not know what to do next. So my aim here is just to keep going. I want to just keep working on areas and not question myself too much about what should come next. I am starting to work on the finer details now with the roof, as I'm feeling like I'm ready to start getting into those finer details and the final stages of it. So I'm going to start with the roof and just paint in what I see. And this does take me quite a bit of time because I like to paint in the intricate details. So I spend a lot of time using my round brush, just getting in all the details I can see. And then I just slowly make my way down and I work on that sign on the front of it and then just the little details around it. Sometimes it's easier for me to not think about what I'm painting and just look at the value of it, try and get the color somewhat close and just apply that on and just keep working at it until it looks like what it's supposed to. I also find that working from dark to light works best for me. I like getting those dark values in first and then saving those bright highlights for the end when everything kind of comes together. I'm going back to work on the windows, and I'm mixing up yellow ochre with a little less white this time, as I want to get in some of the darker valleys in there. And then between that, I'm also going to just darken the reflections as I feel that I need to. I'm switching here to a size 1 liner brush so I can paint the lines in more precisely and a little bit more easily. I'm placing in a little bit of shadow underneath each of the lines and a little bit to the left of it. When I come in to refine the details, all I'm really thinking to myself is just placing the shadows and some highlights. And what initially looked like a very flat painting can start to come together easily just by adding in the shadows and the highlights. You can see here I used the same approach to paint in this bush. I'm going in with slightly more opaque paint and a dark value to indicate the shadows at the bottom, and then thicker paint and a lighter value up the top, and already the form of the shape starts to come out very easily, and then it's just a matter of getting the little details in later. I build in a little bit of texture using my flat brush here. I also build in the shadow that is cast onto the ground a little bit, and then using the same brush I try to scrub in a bit of the grassy textures on the ground and along the edge of the base of the wall. When I'm painting in the ground, I'm still keeping the paint relatively thin because I feel like that conveys the texture of it best. You can see that I've used it so thin that the paint has bled across the ground, and I really like that texture, so I try to keep it that way, and I keep it nice and thin so it has a bit of that grainy texture, and then I just layer on some of the grass on top of it and around it, but I don't cover all of the ground in an opaque layer. Now I'm working on some of the details on the bush, and then I'm going to paint in that little statue in front of the doorway. At first I planned to leave that little area white and not paint it in, so it would make it easier for myself to paint in the statue afterwards because the statue is quite light. But I got a little bit lazy and just ended up painting in the whole doorway, and I thought I would just deal with this problem later. So how I'm managing to layer on this very light color on top is I am doing it slowly and in layers. So I apply a first layer which looks quite transparent, but I wait for it to dry completely before I apply a second layer, and I slowly build up the layers until it becomes more opaque. And also in the way that I apply my brush strokes, I'm kind of tapping on the paint instead of applying in long strokes, which is more likely to reactivate the dark paint beneath it. I'm painting in the details very carefully here and just tapping it on slowly. I switched to my liner brush for the very thin lines. I actually didn't like how the face turned out the first time I painted it, so I just went over it again using the tapping technique where I tapped on the lighter paint and then just repainted in the face. Now I'm going back to work on the foliage, as I feel like the building is mostly done, so I'm just going to work on the foliage surrounding the building and also on the ground. I'm mixing up some of the cool blue with a lot of white and just detailing some of the highlights on the ground. I use my finger to blend out the colors so that way the paint isn't so thick, and I like the texture that I get from doing this. I'm moving back to work on the foliage again. I'm using a lot of yellow ochre mixed with some of the pre-mixed greens and just getting in some of the textures and the shadows in there. I'm now using a round brush to get in the textures that I want, and I will switch to a round brush with a pointier tip later to paint in the leafy details. For the darker shadows, I'm mixing black with yellow and green, and I'm placing that in underneath. It looks quite dark at first, but I'm not too worried as I know I can always just layer on some lighter green on top if I need to. I used the Jade Green that comes in this Himi set, which I usually don't use just because that green is so unnatural and I don't really see it much in the paintings that I do, but actually it was the perfect color for some of the foliage in this scene. I just had to tone it down a little bit with some red. I'm finally up to the stage where I can detail on the individual leaves using my pointed round brush, and I'm using a bluish green to paint this on. I'm using the cool blue mixed with lots of white and just a little bit of yellow to push it a little bit towards green. And then I'm just going to go along and paint in all of those little leafy details. For these details on the wall, I'm using a mixture of white with some yellow ochre, and I'm scrubbing it on with a bit of a dry brush. I'm using the texture of my brush to scrub on some of that color to mimic the look of wear and tear on this wall. For the part that's in the shadow, I make the paint just slightly darker, and that way it's consistent with the shadow that is cast from the ledge onto the wall. I use my fingers also to smudge out some of the paint I laid down so it has more of a scratched look, and now I'm having fun just adding on highlights and those fine details. This of course is always my favorite step, when I can add on those brightest highlights and make areas of the painting just pop. I work on the details, on the reflection one more time, and this is one of the things that I really love about gouache, is the amount of layers you can get in as long as you're being quite gentle with it. Also, this moleskin sketchbook is pretty strong. The paper is only 165 GSM, but it can withstand quite a few washes of gouache as long as you're careful with it. So I hope you enjoyed seeing my process for this piece. This video wasn't exactly a tutorial, but more just like a talk through of my process and my approach to this piece. Let me know if you have any questions down below, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye!